Hi everyone, I'm Amanda Borshel-Dunn, the Jewish World Editor at the Times of Israel. Welcome to our inaugural Times of Israel Behind the Headlines conversation. Today, we'll hear from two of my journalism mentors, my current boss, David Horovitz, the founding editor of the Times of Israel, and my previous boss, Bret Stephens, who has been, since 2017, an op-ed columnist at the New York Times. Now, Bret is a rare writer who can seamlessly transition between scathing analyses on foreign policy and domestic policy, and also transition to moving personal essays. He is, in my experience, a contrarian with insatiable curiosity and a willingness to explore untested and even sometimes unsavory ideas. This has served him well, though, because in 2013, Bret was awarded the Pulitzer Prize for commentary while he was still at the Wall Street Journal. Now, in 2014, years before the election of US President Donald Trump and the current coronavirus crisis, Bret published his book, America in Retreat, The New Isolationism and the Coming Global Disorder. So I'm looking forward to hearing about the current global disorder and everything else they have to say in this conversation.
Okay, thanks, Amanda. And Bret, it's good afternoon from Jerusalem. Good morning to you. Thanks for joining us. We also have a connection. You were editing the Jerusalem Post until 2004, and I took over.
You were upstairs.
Yeah, that's right. And then I moved downstairs and took over from you. So we've kept in touch occasionally over the years. And like I say, thanks for doing this. So I want to ask you. I mean, this is not this is meant to be some kind of conversation, and I'd like to sort of tap into some of your expertise, and also a lot of our readers are in Israel, and the more that we can help them understand the United States now and again is good, and vice versa. I'd like to have more of a sense, distance creates its difficulties. I'd like to have more of a sense of what's going on in the States, including how we look and some of the implications for us. So, the first thing that I want to talk to you about is this virus, which the smart people who I've spoken to always told me it's a very simple virus. It's not that complicated. It doesn't seem to radically mutate. And yet it seems to be incredibly hard to pin down. You think you've got it beat, and it turns out that you haven't. It curiously seems to spread very rapidly, courtesy of some super spreaders, but not in other circumstances. What is your sense both of the virus, and I don't know what expertise you have, and in the way the world is grappling with this pandemic?
Well, obviously, I'm not an epidemiologist, and I think we've all been surprised in one way or another, those of us who are experts and those are us who are not, about the way in which it has moved and mutated and spread and devastated much of the world. I think there are two aspects that ought to be separated here. One is the virus itself, which seems to be about perhaps 2 or 3 times more deadly than a bad flu strain, which is to say less than what we had feared at the very beginning of the crisis, but still devastating. And the second aspect is how we have reacted to the virus, which has had its own knock-on consequences, in some ways as devastating and dislocating as any previous pandemic. There was a terrible flu in the late 1950s, but the United States didn't shut down. There was a far more deadly flu exactly a century or so ago, and even then the US didn't shut down. So it's not only a pandemic, it's also a geopolitical crisis, the likes of which are hard to recall in our lifetimes. It has weakened democracy. It has strengthened the enemies of democracy, not least because they are more indifferent to human life. It's had incalculable economic consequences. We're suffering through a higher unemployment rate in the United States than any we've seen since nearly the Great Depression. And I don't think it's anywhere near done doing its work. For us in the United States, David, one of the bitter surprises here has in fact been your experience in Israel, where we thought that you had really beaten this and that you could come to a point where transmission was so low that effectively it was on its way to extinction, especially because you're able more capably than we are to close your borders. But clearly that's not the case. And it raises the possibility that even if the United States were to bring it to very low levels, that it could recur in a dramatic way. The one thing I'm taking some heart in, and again, this is provisional, I don't want to present myself as an expert, is that right now case levels in the United States are rising very sharply, but so far the death rate has not risen commensurately as it did during the first wave. And what this tells us about who's getting infected, how many people are being tested, I think that still remains to be seen, but at least in that sense, it doesn't seem to be as vicious as it was back in April.
Yeah, I'll just fill in some of the specifics on Israel. They told us the other day that the average age of the fatalities in Israel, I think this is correct, that's what they said, is 80. In other words, we are suffering, almost every day is 2,000 new cases, which is much higher than it was in the first wave. The highest it got to in the first wave was 800. But the death rate, there were 21 countries surveyed by the FT. We're one of the 3 where the death rate in the last, in the corona period that they were measuring was lower. Our overall death rate was lower than last year and on the average of the last 5 years. So it hasn't caused a drastic rise in deaths. Even though we're back in this second wave. Economically devastating, unemployment went to 25%. This is Israel, which had less than 4% in March. I want to come back to the democracy aspect. Where do you see this playing out in its starkest way? In the United States, or which other places do you see really the nature of government is going to be changed in the long term by what's been playing out?
Well, the most obvious example, I think, is Hong Kong, where the virus proved not only devastating to so many Chinese lives, I think many more than have been counted, but it also, I think, was the death knell to the Chinese, the Hong Kong democracy movement, at least for the time being. It allowed Chinese authorities to impose this hugely unpopular law. In Hungary, again, it allowed Viktor Orban to essentially rule by decree. He was already moving in that direction. And there's a saying that dictatorship breeds disease, right? Because it suppresses information, because it doesn't care for public services, it doesn't care about human life. But the opposite of that also is true, which is that disease breeds dictatorship. And I think that the arguments have been made that this is an opportunity to crack down on civil liberties. Obviously, I'm not making the suggestion here that wearing a mask is a terrible infringement on one's human rights. But across the world, this virus seems to have been a fantastic argument for every despot to control much more of the lives of their citizens than they would have dared previously. So I actually think this is an inflection point, a kind of a seminal event in the 21st century that people will be thinking and writing about from a political point of view 50 and 100 years hence.
Okay, and then, so how is this playing out in the States where, well, I don't, you describe this however you wish to, but there is certainly a sense of a leadership that, unlike Israel's, was reluctant to acknowledge what it was up against early on, has been somewhat dismissive, inconsistent, and then all the complexities of just this vast country with the individual states and their issues and choices and so on, and a president who, again, I'm talking to you from distance, who for whom this seems to not be playing out terribly well, to put it mildly.
Well, let's see about that. I mean, I don't want to stand by every bet I've made. I said early on in this crisis that Donald Trump would come out ahead in the coronavirus crisis. And maybe I'm just so scarred from the experience of 2016 when I was absolutely certain that he was going to lose. And then, of course, he defied expectations that has hobbled my thinking. Look, in the United States, I think what it has revealed in a very big way is that we have a system that is hobbled by bad decision-making, incompetence, overlapping authorities, and the inability to simply make consistent, coherent, and intellectually defensible decisions. It has really exposed, I think, aspects of American political and cultural life that were sort of there to see previously, but maybe were masked by a relatively robust economy and relatively placid international circumstances. It's hard for me, despite all of China's weaknesses and woes, not to see this as a moment when, if I were in the Chinese leadership, I would feel relatively emboldened by seeing the extent to which the United States has simply been incompetent in the face of this crisis. Again, it's another reason why I think that the geopolitical side of the coronavirus will be perhaps more consequential in the long term than the epidemiological, the health aspect.
Right, in a way that brings us to Amanda's reference to your book, right? Because 6 years ago, you're talking about America in retreat and an empowering of Putin and China and of Iran. You know, at that time, you know, in the context of Obama's false sense of America's decline, as you saw it. Is it still a full sense? Is America in decline? Is this, as you said, some kind of inflection point?
Yeah, I mean, look, you're holding up the book somewhat as a prophetic book. I now have some misgivings about what I wrote. I thought I predicted Hillary Clinton would be president now. And I was, of course, had no idea and did not predict or even, I think, mention the possibility of a pandemic having these kinds of effects. What I was worried about was a shrunken vision of America's role in the world that began with President Obama talking about nation building at home and sort of decreasing America's footprint, and which has in fact continued with President Trump. There's more foreign policy continuity between Trump and Obama than I think either side cares to admit. But when you look at President Trump talking about pulling troops out of South Korea or Germany seeking a rapprochement with North Korea, there's that kind of quasi-isolationist instinct. I don't want to say it's isolationist, but a quasi-isolationist instinct at play too. And I think that's also had a bad effect for the United States. We are well served when America is a confident liberal, in the old-fashioned sense, confident liberal power, providing a margin of safety between freedom and despotism at the edges of the world. And I think that's something that ought to concern Israel. You know, Israel came into existence right after the declaration of the Truman Doctrine. It has always existed under at least the theoretical umbrella of Pax Americana. Obviously, that didn't come really into being until after 1967. But Israel is now going to have to consider what it means to live in a post-Pax Americana world, where there is no assurance that at the very end of the day, those C-5 Galaxy planes will be landing in Tel Aviv, unloading American tanks in your moment of distress, as what happened in 1973. So I think any Israeli leader, while it's important to keep an eye on good relations with the United States, with both parties in the United States, I should stress, needs to also have a sense that the American moment may be fading, just as the British moment did 80 years ago.
You think that's already the situation, Bret? That if we were in a moment of crisis, Israel, right now, we would be naive to assume that America has our back at a last resort?
Well, I mean, Israel is in the happy situation that Jared and Ivanka seem to have a happy marriage, right? And so, so you have a son-in-law in the White House who is very influential and whose affinities are no secret. But let's imagine that you had, a president with the same viewpoint as Donald Trump, except not a warm spot in his heart for the Jewish state. I think that's extremely possible. Joe Biden is not anti-Israel. He's made that clear. He's put daylight between himself and the most anti-Israel elements of his caucus that are growing in strength. But in 2024, will you have a Democratic presidential candidate and a Republican presidential candidate who have this enlarged sense of Pax Americana, of what the United States owes its democratic allies and why Israel is an ally worth cultivating and preserving, I'm really skeptical about that.
Okay, I don't want to get, I don't want to sound sanguine because 2024 isn't terribly far away, but I'm a little relieved to think that 2020 is not that crisis point. In other words, you know, having said what you said, your bottom line seems to be that with Trump, for whatever reason, America does have our back.
With Trump, I think America does, but you know, he's a very fickle president, and you know, it was fire and fury with North Korea until Kim Jong-un became his best friend in the world. Why can't the opposite happen over, you know, Trump's political opportunity or political self-interest in the opposite direction? I think that's really worth thinking about. You know, it's important to note that Richard Nixon was pro-Israel in spite of his anti-Semitism, because he had a strategic concept which was larger than his personal prejudice. I don't think Donald Trump has that strategic concept. In fact, to the extent that he has a strategic concept, it moves in exactly the opposite direction. His strategic concept is unfavorable to Israel. His personal prejudice is. And that may not remain the case forever.
I want to quote something you wrote, and I don't want to take it out of context, but at all. I want you to tell me how it applies now. Because you wrote in March, and I didn't go reading masses and masses and quite huge chunks of your work, don't worry. But I was struck by this: a leader who cannot be believed will not be followed, even or especially in periods of emergency, right? So we're in the situation now in Israel, really in the last few days, where Netanyahu, who I wrote very positively about in the context of the virus in the first wave, he's really flailing, or he appears to be flailing. And there seems to me to be an increasing disinclination of what has been a very relatively disciplined Israeli public to listen to what he's ordering us to do anymore. Restaurants were supposed to close down on Friday. They just said, we're not going to do it. And he rolled back the decree. He was going to give out a little less than $2 billion to all Israelis indiscriminately to get the economy rolling again. And that's being changed today because there was so much criticism. It seemed so absurd. You know, your president, I'm not sure how much he's believed. I'm not sure how much he's being followed. And I don't know how this applies elsewhere in the world. And is that one of the reasons why you're seeing democracies in increasing trouble and a more sort of tyrannical approach emerging? Just give me your thoughts on all of that.
Well, look, I mean, I am, you know, openly, I don't want to say confused, but deeply torn on the subject of whether Trump's lack of credibility will be his downfall or his talents as a demagogue will ultimately rescue him. And I have to say that there's some kind of balance of dread in my internal in my own thinking, which you know, leads me to contradictory, or what should be, you know, somewhat contradictory conclusions. In any normal democracy, Trump's failures, lack of credibility with respect to the pandemic would be devastating his chances of re-election. But this is a guy who just simply plays by a very different set of rules in a country, I must say, that has become a kind of, has become receptive to reality television in a degree that perhaps isn't quite the same as it is in Israel. Now, following Netanyahu, what surprises me the most, and I'm curious for your take, David, too, is, you know, I always thought that Netanyahu's lack of scruples, his intense personal ambitions, his kind of fast and loose with ethics approach, all of that was offset by a very great intelligence and a high degree of competence, which made him to an Israeli public, not the devil, you know, but the macher, you know, taken with all his warts, but a competent executive. And what has really struck me, just following the news by reading the Times of Israel, is how he seems to have simply lost that in the last few weeks, whether it's on account of his personal anxieties over his legal situation or pressures over annexation. I'm not sure, or simply being surprised by the nature of the course and nature of the virus. It's hard to say. But I am to this even now sort of befuddled by what he was thinking on the subject of annexation. There seems to be no wizard behind behind the curtain there. It was political and geopolitical malpractice, however you look at it. And so I don't know. You tell me. Has Bibi lost his mojo, or is there an idea here? It's hard for me to say.
Well, in trying to answer that, I have to sort of add the caveats that you put regarding you and Trump, right? Because it's been very tempting many times over the years to think or to start drawing conclusions that Netanyahu's finished and so on. He certainly has not functioned particularly well in the last few weeks. We had a piece that we ran yesterday by my colleague Chaviv Bret, which talked about how well he did in the first wave, and then he sort of took his eye off the ball and cited the things that you cited just now, the trial and the preoccupation with annexation. But there was a failure. It was a failure to put in place the kind of testing regime that would have allowed us to more quickly trace and stop, hopefully, some of these outbreaks and so on. Look,
but you asked a larger question, which I didn't really answer, and that's this, which is in the 1920s there was a great retreat in democracy throughout the world. All kinds of young democracies collapsed into quasi-authoritarianism. And in this sense, I think my book was prophetic in that I think we are witnessing a similar retreat, based not because the dictatorships are doing so well, often they're not doing well at all. Look at Iran's internal crises, but because there's been a kind of loss of faith in American publics in the institutions of liberal democracy and in the values of liberal democracy. Maybe the values side counts for even more. I now look at American politics not as a contest between liberals and conservatives contesting policy issues while sharing at least a broad set of overarching values. I increasingly look at it as a contest between liberals and illiberals, and liberals who are former Republicans, former Democrats, or even current Democrats, who are, who believe in values like free speech, pluralism, tolerance, constitutional procedures, the presumption of innocence, all the rest of that. And the new illiberals, who are sometimes the Trumpians on the right, but are often the so-called dirtbag left, the wokesters on the left, who have abandoned any faith in what they call the system and what it stands for, which is a certain kind of habit of mind and of spirit and of a sense of owing even your opponents a certain amount of respect and a sense of fellow citizenship. That seems to be vanishing in the United States. I think it has eroded in Israel. I think it is eroding in many places in Europe as you see the rise of the far left and the far right encroach on the space of the previous centrist incumbent parties. And that, I think, is something that needs to worry any of us who care about what used to be called the fate of the West.
Yeah, so I think there's a lot of truth in that. I think we're maybe you guys are ahead of us for worse on that track. And I think, Netanyahu has been, I've often been very supportive of Netanyahu as somebody who's kept this country relatively safe in a very difficult period from outside threats, but has been, fueling intolerance and divisiveness within. And that's, that is playing out increasingly in Israel, sort of intolerance. Look, we went so far. We went to the terrible depth of assassinating our own prime minister a quarter century ago. And I think Israeli society has sought to pull back from that and realizes generally that if we're terrible to each other, we will be so weak and we would then become vulnerable, existentially vulnerable, which is a pretty potent deterrence against being absolutely horrible to each other. But I think it's a rising concern. And coming back to your Netanyahu question and has he lost the plot? He's been blessed to some extent with extraordinarily helpful opposition. I mean, he nearly lost power, and he really was the other guy had the mandate to form a government at the end of March, when, to my abiding lack of comprehension, Benny Gantz chose to instead abandon the pledge of 3 election campaigns and partner with Netanyahu. Now that kept Netanyahu in power. It also meant that it sort of almost destroyed Israeli opposition. And what you're seeing in the last few days is a rising level of sort of public anger, not across the board at all, but thousands of people coming out to demonstrate. There was been demonstrations in Jerusalem, which is traditionally a pretty conservative and orthodox city, and thousands of young Jerusalemites. I don't think they're all bussing in from outside, because there's no conventional opposition to talk of, and people are frustrated, and there's this terrible pandemic. There's a lot of that coming to the fore, and a prime minister who seems to have kind of gotten it wrong. But I wouldn't write him off at all. I marvel at him, Bret. I don't know. I think the job of being the president of the United States and prime minister of Israel, these are astounding jobs. I think about what you do and trying to put out there thoughts that you think are important, and by extension, put yourself on the line a little bit. And the things that we do at the Times of Israel, this is serious work that we do, but we don't hold the well-being and fates of our nations on our shoulders. And I just marvel of all the world leaders who really ought to feel that responsibility. The Prime Minister of Israel, boy, is that a role where even if you don't do anything particularly stupid, the consequences can be terrible. And I'm astounded that for 13 years and more, Netanyahu has done as exceptionally well as he has done, that he's thrived, that he's somehow kept on going with all these challenges outside and all these people around his cabinet table who loathe him, and somehow maneuvering. And at home, difficult characters, shall we say, in his own home. And it's not at all surprising that he's, had a little bit of a hiccup in the last couple of weeks. But this is an extraordinary figure. And therefore, although he seems to have lost it a little bit, there's no strong political opposition to him. And, I would be really wary of drawing any long-term conclusions as far as he's concerned, at least.
Oh, look, and I think you're probably right. I wrote a column, I think more than 18 months ago in January of 2019, when people were writing his political obituary. And I said, don't rule him out, for the simple reason, astounding to many readers of the Times, that Bibi has actually been a pretty damn good prime minister. If you look at where Israel is geopolitically, until recently economically, in terms of its security, compared to where it had been, say, when I was at the Jerusalem Post, back in the worst moments of the Second Intifada, the progress has been astonishing. I think it is important for Israel's maturity as a democracy to come to the appreciation that there is no such thing as an indispensable man or woman. And 11 years continuously in power, I guess 14 years overall, is more than enough. There is a value at change at the top, and I do worry about this sense that one man can serves as the margin of a country's safety, however competent the execution has been.
Right.
But it's also quite a thought that I think should exercise Israelis, that the cause of Israel has increasingly become a partisan cause in the United States. I think it's telling. We just had an election here in southern part of Westchester, just north of New York, where Eliot Engel, long-term pro-Israel Democrat, just lost his primary to a much more quote-unquote progressive candidate. The Democratic Party is changing, and eventually Democrats will be in power, whether it's in in January, or sometime down the road. And I think it's important for Israelis to maintain that sense that a solid relationship with both parties in the United States is a national strategic priority. So naming a town after Donald Trump in Golan or wherever, I think it was Golan, right?
Yep.
The sort of a certain quality of going beyond what is necessary for protocol and decency to get along with the president, that's something that should concern every Israeli, and I think it should concern pro-Israel Americans like me. I take a lot of flack for this, by the way, among the right side of American Jewish political opinion, and that I have not kind of sung Trump's praises enough in terms of his Israel policy. And in fact, I've supported the move of the embassy to Jerusalem. I cheered his withdrawal from the JCPOA. But that being said, Trump has a concept of American power which is antithetical to Israel's interest. And he has a demonstrated character of fickleness and fecklessness that might serve Israel very ill at a moment of truth. And so I think it's hugely important for Americans on the right, Jewish Americans or pro-Israel Americans on the right, not to become too complacent about what a Trump presidency means for the U.S.-Israel relationship.
Yeah, look, that's obviously one of the long-term criticisms of Netanyahu, that he's acting as though the pendulum doesn't swing. I just want to come back to, Israelis and Netanyahu. The big difference that we have with you, we don't have term limits, right? You have a one-term or a two-term president. Netanyahu, like Thatcher, can go on and on and on. And when you've got to the stage that we're at now, as you said, 11 years consecutive and another 3 years before, there's half a generation that has only ever known Netanyahu as prime minister. They've just seen the leader of the opposition, who was the most credible opposition candidate that we've had in a decade, basically throw up his hands and join forces with him. There's a psychological barrier to anybody who tries to unseat Netanyahu, which, and he's no fool, and he's not somebody who off the cuffs it, and he's not somebody who tends to the outrageous pronouncement and then backtracking and so on. He's more than a fairly competent leader on the whole in a country that doesn't have to. Sorry, go on.
What was his thinking behind July 1 and the annexation deadline?
Well, the July 1 was the date that he foisted upon a reluctant Gantz, I think, by which he could start to move it forward. I don't know, because it's the same question that you asked before. It didn't begin as a strategic policy. Netanyahu has been aware of the danger of Israel becoming forever entangled among millions of hostile Palestinians, and therefore the danger of losing the majority Jewish state or subverting the democracy. He's always been aware of that. And he made a speech at Bar-Ilan University, which indicated a desire with lots of conditions to try to find a way to separate. This came up because he was trying to marginalize the parties to the right of him. And then I don't know how it developed or why it developed or what kind of interaction with who in the administration. But it was a selling point. It was a selling point in the elections to keep the parties to the right weaker, to make sure the Likud was strong. It may have been crucial to the fact that he was able to survive electorally. But then, why go on pushing it in the way that he pushed it? Has he become persuaded that it's necessary? I'm not convinced of that, but I can't give you, I haven't got an acceptable explanation. I really don't.
And it wasn't a diversionary tactic for mysterious explosions in Iran that took place a few days later?
Well, that's very interesting. Well, a few days later than what? I mean, there have been some explosions taking place in Iran, and Amos Yadlin, who's a very savvy former head of military intelligence, tweeted cagily that according to foreign reports, Netanyahu hasn't been preoccupied with annexation at all, but rather with making sure that Iran didn't make progress on the nuclear drive. Maybe that's in the mix. And the more cynical take is that this is all about deflecting attention, not from Iran, but from his legal difficulties and so on.
Right.
So, let's just come back, and I don't want to keep you all day. There's a few little last things that I do want to ask you about. You've kind of answered it in a way, but does Trump care about annexation? I suspect not at all. Does the evangelical community care about annexation in the way that it cared about Jerusalem? and what might a Democratic president, a President Biden, do about annexation?
Well, one of the reasons why I think annexation is a bad idea is, what happens if Biden wins and Secretary of State Susan Rice, let's say, strong arms the Israelis into reversing the decision by, say, threatening to withhold military aid. At that point, it would be a massive, what began as a sort of a political gambit, as you put it, to keep peace with Netanyahu's parties to the right, would become a confrontation with the United States and potentially, a humiliation of the sort that Eisenhower inflicted on Anthony Eden, for your terms of reference there, back in 1956. So that's something to bear in mind. I don't think Trump cares one way or the other. I literally think it would be the first thing that pops out of his mouth in that respect. So, and in terms of the evangelicals, look, this is a complicated question. Evangelicals are, plural and have many views, but I don't think it has any salience. They see it just as, I think many people see it as basically a strategic question. Israel should not cede territories now or in the future that would be of vital strategic importance in the 10 years from now in the event of a war, but whether it remains under one form of one legal doctrine or another, under formal military control or civilian control, I think is sort of a distinction without a difference to most American evangelicals. It is not Jerusalem. It is not necessarily Hebron. It is not about the Jewish connection to the land. It's a strategic question and a political question for Israelis. So I think, evangelicals are often highly sophisticated political observers, and I think they can argue it both ways. Their support for Israel is going to have nothing to do with what the legal status is of the Jordan River Valley.
Let me ask you a question very close to home. Essentially, what's going on at the New York Times? I'm thinking about particularly Barry Weiss resigning and saying she was called a Nazi and a racist and mocked for writing about the Jews again.
You know what? I'm going to, in the interest of not having to choose between my friend and my employer, just openly dodge your question. I think Barry has been a friend of mine for more than 15 years, and she's an extraordinarily talented person. And I think it's everyone's loss that she's not at the Times. But I think it would be bad manners and bad judgment to get into the weeds there for reasons I hope that you can appreciate. I will say that it is important, and I thought about this when I went to the Times, that the paper have someone on its editorial pages who takes a very clear view of not only, never mind Israel's right to exist, but its right to thrive and its right to make its case in a world that consists of real enemies and phony friends. And what I see myself doing out of convictions that long predate my tenure at the Times is upholding that view, just as Bill Safire did, just as A.M. Rosenthal did. So putting Barry to one side, that's what I'm going to continue to do at the Times. One point I will make, which I think is general and to all media, is that media institutions have been ill-served by allowing people to use social media in a way that is their own personal editorial platform. And I'm speaking not about the Times here, I'm speaking about just about all media. If I were editor-in-chief of any newspaper, I would ban individual Twitter accounts, except if it's about your puppy. Because the news consumer is entitled not to know the political views of reporters who are, in the final analysis, paid not to have an opinion. And I am paid to have an opinion. I'm an opinion writer. That is my job description. But people who are reporters are actually expected by their audiences to submerge their personal views in the interests of a more objective version of the truth. And to the extent that they don't do that, and to the extent that they take advantage of new tools of social media to make their opinions and their personal animosities perfectly well known, they are undermining trust in the institutions with which they are affiliated. And that's you know, if you look at trends in trust in newspaper, trust in media, you can point fingers in all kinds of directions as to why that trend continues to decline year after year. But I think it behooves those of us in this industry to think that we may have played a role in that declining trust by constantly trumpeting a set of prejudices and biases, politically and otherwise, that our readers aren't interested in knowing. You know, there's a wonderful scene in Dr. Strangelove where the Russian ambassador is in an argument somewhere in the, you know, the war room of the Pentagon. And he's in an argument with, I think, an American general making the case that the United States, like Russia, was developing its own doomsday machine. And the American general says, you know, ambassador, that's a lie. And the ambassador retorts by saying, I read it in the New York Times, and it is an argument closer. And we should aspire to be an institution and a country where the moment you say, I read it in the New York Times, it basically ends the argument on points of fact. So we have to work, and I don't mean we as the Times, but all media, all news media have to work to bringing ourselves back to that level where to say that you read it in the Times means there is simply no question as to its factuality in the minds of its opponents and friends alike.
That's fascinating, Bret, really. I could ask you lots more, and I want to be respectful of your time. I want to thank you, really. It was fascinating to talk to you. I wish you well. I wish our industry well. I wish the world well, grappling with this pandemic, and that we get maybe better leadership than we deserve, competent leadership in all of our countries. Bret, take care of yourself. Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks.